வெல்கம் பேக். நாங்கள் நோர்வேயினுடைய சமாதான முயற்சிகள் குறித்து ஒரு புத்தகத்தை எழுதியிருக்கும் மார்க் சோல்டர் அவர்களுடன் நாம் இப்போது மற்ற கலந்துரையாடலை தொடரலாம். மார்க், in 2005, if the incumbent Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe had been allowed to win the election, or the LTTE had allowed the people to vote, and if he had been elected as the Prime Minister or the President, do you think he would have gone for peace? Or peace, he would have continued to carry on with the peace process that he started, or do you think he would have chosen the path of Mahinda Rajapaksa?
Well, I think the evidence of his behaviour...
But what was Norway's taking on that?
Well, I mean, I think that, yes, the Norwegians definitely... Well, there were two parts to the assessment. One part was that, yes, Ranil Wickremesinghe, would be the known character. We know what kind of policies he would pursue. When it came to Rajapaksa, I think actually the Norwegian assessment at the time of the elections, like much of the international community, was, well, okay, here's a new, unknown figure. He's made some noises, but we don't know exactly what he's going to go for. And I can tell you that I think you heard it at the launch in London a few weeks ago, that it seems that to both Vidar Helgesen and Erik Solheim, Rajapaksa basically said, well, in one case he said, look, federal solution, sure, we can do that. I mean, we can have a northern region with Prabhakaran as the ruler, and we don't even have to have elections. He can just, take over, which was pretty extraordinary. And then to Erik Solheim, to Vidar Helgesen, he said, look, yes, I just want a deal. I want just a deal. Me and Prabhakaran will go and sit somewhere in a back room and we'll just make a deal. I'll do that, but I won't have a bunch of talks because that'll go on forever and then I'll undermine my Sinhalese support. So, that was the feeling that there was about Rajapaksa's style. So I don't think people really understood. Maybe Rajapaksa himself didn't even understand at that stage that it would be full-out war within a year.
But he continued 2 more rounds, isn't it?
He was three?
He continued 2 more rounds of peace talks.
Well, yes, he did, but
so that went wrong.
Well, if you, as you'll see in the book, if you just read the descriptions of those rounds of talks in Geneva, I mean, yes, they were talks, but they were of a totally different character to the talks previously. I mean, for starters, the government delegation in Geneva for both those rounds was a massive delegation, and it was just Rajapaksa pulling in everybody. It didn't really matter where they were on the political spectrum. In fact, he wanted the full spectrum to keep everybody on his side. So there was no, apart from Nirupam da Silva, there were no skilled negotiators. Already that horrible stuff had been happening, on the military front, so the atmosphere was quite tense anyway. And I mean, as you know, in the second round, ultimately the government side walked out because they said, there's nothing to talk about. So, I mean, that's not, that was a different kind of negotiation.
So what did the international community do about it? Why didn't they apply pressure? The international community just kept quiet and supporting his war campaign of war.
No.
Because Gotabaya Rajapaksa was the American citizen, Bachel Rajapaksa was the American citizen, he's the American citizen, Army commander was the American citizen, and the foreign secretary was the Australian citizen. So almost all of them are dual citizens from a foreign country. But why couldn't the international community put some tangible pressure on them to make sure that they stuck to the table?
Well, I think there was pressure on to stay on the table, but don't forget that, in the meantime, I mean, we'd had things like the LTTE's murder of the Sri Lankan foreign minister, Lakshman Kadrigama, which is what led to the EU's decision to prescribe the tigers in June 2006. Now, once they're prescribed, which is true, the Americans and the Brits were, it's like you're basically, the message then from key international institutions is, we're dealing with terrorists. And then you think about the post 9/11 context, this is not exactly a context that is going to encourage Western powers to say, no, the government of that country is the people we should be pressurizing, not the terrorists on the other side. So, I mean, I could agree with you that, I do actually agree with you that more pressure should have been put on the government the Rajapaksa government. But it's just that, again, the LTTE didn't exactly help things by doing stuff like shooting Kadrigama, because it was like as if saying, see, proof, we said they're terrorists, now we've got the evidence.
But it is the government which carried out carpet bombing, cluster bombing, and firing on Norway, so on. Then you have written at length about it,
absolutely.
and firing at hospitals, violating all the international humanitarian and human rights laws. But still, the international community is still supporting, even at the Human Rights Council.
Well, no, but don't forget, when we get into things like carpet bombing and hospitals, I mean, then we're really into the final stages of the war, and there the equation has shifted significantly. I think you just, I mean, it's a sad fact, but you can't underestimate, I think, the impact that terrorist, and I am, saying in inverted commas, terrorist actions had on international actors in the context of the war on terror, more briefly. And the Rajapaksa government was by and large successful in persuading significant sections of the government, of the international community, that its war against the LTTE was not just a national war against a domestic insurgency. It was part of this bigger picture of the war on terror. So terrorists in Afghanistan equals terrorists in Sri Lanka. I mean, this bigger picture. And once you've achieved that propaganda victory, very hard, very, very hard to roll back and push back in terms of international pressure. And I really do think that was part of the explanation, not the only thing, but it's part of the explanation for the international community's, if you like, weakness or failure. The fact that there was not a stronger pushback against the
because from the victim's point of view, from Banmi and the north and east, is the fact that they place a lot of trust on the international community. If we go to the final stage of the war, that there will be some rescue. Yeah. What is happening thereafter in the international forums like UN and UN Human Rights Council? Still, the Sri Lankan government is being backed by the so-called world that has supported the war.
Yeah, I mean, it's true that...
Where's the balance?
It's true that in the immediate aftermath of the war, you remember this disgraceful session of the UN Human Rights Council just after the war, which issues a message congratulating the Rajapaksa government on its victory in the war against terror. There absolutely, but I mean, pretty soon after that, you're starting to see the international forum becoming precisely the place where the Rajapaksa government was being contested. So the Human Rights Council every year, successively, all those resolutions that were very explicitly, hanging out to dry the government for its human rights abuses, and even with the panel of experts report in 2011, then for the first time the UN saying, look, actually the casualties in the war may be much higher, far higher than anything that any official...
And they should have spoken then.
Well, but perhaps the evidence wasn't entirely, or at least the numbers. Maybe they should, but I don't need to go over this for you. You know as well as I do that in autumn 2008, the Sri Lankan government kicked the UN out of the Vani. They forced them and other international agencies, with a few exceptions of individuals, out of the area. There's no witnesses. There's certainly no foreign journalists there. So, things did happen by and large. Not out of sight entirely, because we've seen all the videos and the documentary evidence of different kinds that's come out subsequently. But at the time, I've heard it from, I was talking to Eric Sulheim about this a while ago, and he said, because I was asking him, so how did you follow what was going on, in Sri Lanka during the final stages of the war? He said, I was just like you and anybody else. I was watching whatever there was I could find on the television, because there was nowhere else to find anything. And that's someone who's been following the thing for all that time. So the government management, information management, was very, very successful, unfortunately.
Almost all of them place the blame on Rajapaksa for committing this kind of widespread and systematic war crimes. But all these world leaders, the facilitators, everybody was watching what was happening. They did nothing to prevent that. For killing one foreign minister, a former foreign minister, they banned an organization as terrorist outfit and allowed the government to go on a killing spree. I would read a statement. It is not just the case of 2008. In 2006, I think, immediately after the Rondo conference in Washington, U.S. Undersecretary of State Nicholas Burns, he openly endorsed Sri Lankan government and its military offensive. He says, we support the government. We believe the government has the right to protect the territorial integrity and sovereignty, the stability and the security of the country. We meet often with the government at the highest levels and consider the government to be a friend of our country. So this international community being neutral, it has been always in question.
Well, yeah, but let's be the international community. the Americans by that stage is not the same thing as the UN, which is not the same thing as the Norwegians. I mean, neutrality, I think, by that stage, neutrality was an almost impossible position to maintain because, as you said yourself, silence was tantamount to allowing things to go on. But I would just say to you at the same time, put yourself, what in fact would you propose that the international community did once the killing really, got underway in the north? I mean, what, military intervention? It's like the Americans, after all the experiences of Iraq and Afghanistan, they were going to do another military intervention like a hole in the head. They weren't going to go anywhere near that. The government knew that. And there was no, the Indians weren't going to do it again after, so there was nobody out there with the political will, even the military will, to do anything about it. And the government knew that, and that's one of the reasons they were able to do what they did.
But the issue is that they supported the war campaign of war. Do you think Sri Lanka has the capacity to carry out a war of this scale on its own?
No. I mean, we know that, for example, after Rajapaksa came to power, that the rearming of the Sri Lankan military was chiefly from the Pakistanis, the Chinese, the Israelis, and then intelligence from the Americans and the Indians, okay? And it's like in the Nicholas Burns, statement that you quoted from. I mean, there you get it. It's like the Americans did that because they saw this, by the end of the war, as a struggle between a legitimate, sovereign, elected, national government and a terrorist entity. And so, obviously, I mean, which are we going to support as the American government? Well, we're going to support the government. So, in a sense, what I keep trying to do with the book in discussions is to roll back a bit further. Yeah. Not because I want to avoid
absolutely, yes.
But because I think, by that stage, it's pretty hard to see what else could have been done. But if we think about the earlier stages, I think there really are things that could have been done. And I was mentioning to you in the break, and I would like to mention it now, that something that I think is a big lesson learned from the Norwegian facilitation effort is that their failure to push for a bipartisan political consensus within the Sinhalese southern polity. That Ranil came to power, promised a ceasefire, that was great, we've got someone on board here who's going to do peace, and by that stage Chandrika, she's just a pain in the butt, she keeps making things difficult and so on, so we'll leave her aside and just go with Ranil. And that was, you can see why that happened. But ultimately, of course, that was a totally disastrous move because it was like, as I mentioned earlier, when the ISGA proposal comes, Chandrika then spots the opportunity to kind of cut off Ranil and
she's now in charge of reconciliation.
Reconciliation, I know, that's right, in the Sirisena government, that's right. But the history of Sri Lankan politics since independence of these two, well, not long after, but UNP, SLFP, this at their throats. If you say yes, I say no. If you say black, I say white. So never agree, always have to fight because it's about one of us being in power. We know from around the world that peace processes have to have bipartisan support. In Northern Ireland, you would never have been able to have a peace process if you hadn't managed to get some form of agreement between the two parties. And also in Britain, agreement between the Conservative and Labour parties to support the policy on Northern Ireland. So the failure to get that in Sri Lanka, I think, was fundamental. And it's a lesson that, I mean, in a sense, if we cut to today, well, what kind of government do we have today? Well, at some level, you could argue it's a bipartisan, I mean, there's elements of the SLFP and there's Ranil Wickremesinghe, there's UNP, that's the basis on which you can move things forward. If you don't get that, very, very tough. And so I think the Norwegians really take that on board. Another thing which is perhaps worth mentioning is I think the Norwegians now realise that insufficient attention was paid to just the very, very basic thing of communication. That, once the ceasefire agreement was achieved in 2002, what there should have been was a really massive sort of public education campaign whose aim would be not just say peace is fantastic, but here are the material benefits of peace. If your vegetables in the market are cheaper and there's a bigger selection, that's because of the peace process, because now people can trade from Jaffna down to the south and vice versa. So, just selling the benefits of peace. Now, I think the Norwegians would have been prepared to do that, but the government, Ranald's government, pretty much said, no, don't go near any of that stuff. We've got it under control. The trouble was they hadn't. The government failed miserably to sell the peace process to its population.
But the issue is that, when you talk about political solutions to Tamils, these parties tend to show that they are divided. But when there's a military campaign, the entire Sinhalese parties, entire southern political parties supported. Rajapaksa has the biggest ever budget in parliament, and Ranil Wickremesinghe, the incumbent prime minister, supported it.
Sure.
Do you think they are...
But don't forget, you say that, and you're right, of course, but don't forget that in the case of the ceasefire agreement, it was Chandrika, the other side of the political equation, who'd been pushing for devolution, the devolution package, all that, through the late 90s, and many elements of which were more radical than what was on the table at the CFA. So actually, both sides of the political equation supported peace in that sense. The reason that they fought was simply because it was about power, about who was going to be in control. And you have to, that's what I'm saying, is to make a peace process work, you've got to have it become an objective in itself. It can't be just seen as an instrument of political power, which is, I think, what happened in Sri Lanka. And, by the same token, Mahinda, when he comes into power, sees pretty quickly that actually the best way to stay in power is to go for the nationalist vote and to push the kind of war solution. Before his election, as I was telling you earlier, it appears that he was perfectly open to kind of apparently peaceful solutions, but he saw that politically he would gain most by that. Can I tell you also, by the way, just as we're on that subject of Rajapaksa's election, something that I cover in detail in the book, and which I think it's a disgrace, or it's amazing that it isn't discussed more widely, which is this question of the election boycott in autumn 2000, the presidential election, when, as we know, the Tamils in the north and east boycotted the election, almost totally, and basically that margin of vote is what secured victory for Mahinda Rajapaksa over Ranil Wickremesinghe. Now, there are allegations that surfaced from very early on that this was the result of a secret agreement between the LTTE leadership and Mahinda for the boycott, and it was a backroom deal, and it had money involved, like how much do you want for boycotting the election? A figure was named, and that figure was paid, $20 million or thereabouts.
Norwegians are aware of this?
Absolutely, everybody's aware of it. It's been in the Sri Lankan media on and off ever since. But it's never, and Ranil Wickremesinghe even referred to it in Parliament quite recently, these allegations. But it's never gone to court, it's never come out.
No substantiation, nobody has.
But why, beyond just making the details clear publicly, why I'm pushing the issues, because I think it's fundamental. If it is in fact the case that Mahinda, the man who destroyed the LTTE, came into power on the backs of a deal with the leader of the LTTE or his proxies, I think there's some profound moral and political conclusions or lessons, or call it what you want. There's some real reflection, for starters, that needs to be done amongst LTTE supporters, or then it's like, we can blame the final stages for the message and but what about that? Because if that hadn't happened, if Ranil had stayed in power, like the question you asked before, it could have been a very, very different trajectory.
You're talking about Norwegians' role in Sri Lanka. What is their role in white flag surrendering? What do you know about that?
Well, I know I can tell you, and it's in the book. I think what we know is that what it appears clear is that the Norwegians, and Erik Solheim in particular, were in touch with Politidivan, certainly with Politidivan, up to a very late stage in the in things, and that the Norwegians, like others, were trying right up to the end to negotiate or support, get an agreement from the government side for what Solheim called an orderly ending to the war, a peaceful surrender. And they kept going with that, and kept asking that message get through to Prabhakaran, and kept asking, has the message got through, and kept not getting an answer. So I think the Norwegians, Erik in particular, were deeply involved.
The white flag surrendering?
Yeah.
Okay. So what do,
Well, in the sense that they tried to get the government or the army to agree to accept surrender by the LTTE leadership.
The Pulidevan and Nadesan you're talking about?
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
And there was conversations between the Norwegian ambassador, Tore Hatrem, in Colombo, and Gotabaya, and with Basil, and probably a range of other people as well. And the impression the Norwegians had is that guarantees, there was an agreement on the government side that yes, this would be the deal. They should come out with flags, and then their surrender would be accepted. Now, we know that that's not that's not the end of the story.
Do you think Norwegian government, now you have dealt with Norwegians at length and deep, do you think Norwegian government will support any war crime probe?
I tell you what I think. I think that if that comes to court, either this new court that Sri Lanka is setting up or any other, I think that, yes, I do. I mean, Erik Solheim has already testified to the UN, precisely in this connection. One thing you need to know about Norway is that whole engagement with Sri Lanka has touched the country, and especially the political leadership, very, very closely. I mean, I am so struck when doing these interviews just how much Norwegians really care still, and how people like Erik Solheim still feel like moral anguish over what happened at the end of the war. So I think you can be very confident that whatever happens for the future, Norway will remain engaged, and they will do it impartially, but they will do it supporting the weak in particular.
Mark, thanks for joining us from far away from your place. Thank you very much. நல்ல நேர்களே, திரு மார்க் சோல்டர் அவர்களுடன் இன்றைய கலந்துரையாடலை இத்துடன் நிறைவு செய்து கொள்கிறோம். நோர்வே நாட்டினுடைய சமாதான முயற்சிகள் தொடர்பான புத்தகத்தை வெளியிட்ட அவர் நோர்வே நாட்டினுடைய அனுசரணை பணிகள் தொடர்பாகவும் ஒட்டுமொத்த சர்வதேச சமூகத்தினுடைய பங்குகள், இலங்கை தொடர்பான சமாதான முயற்சிகளிலையும் போரிலும் சர்வதேச சமூகத்தினுடைய பங்கு எவ்வாறு இருந்தது என்பது குறித்தும் அவர் விரிவான விளக்கத்தை எங்களுக்கு தந்திருந்தார். மற்றொரு நிகழ்ச்சியில் சந்திக்கும் வரை உங்களிடமிருந்து விடைபெற்றுக் கொள்ளும் நான் பி. கருணாகரன். நன்றி.